Alrighty. Alrighty. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Page Chewing. For those of you on the East Coast, it's pretty early. But, however, for example, like CL on the other side of the pond, it's not. So, welcome. Taylor and I are so humbled and honored to have such a fabulous guest today. CL Clark, well known author, very prominent member of the writing community. So thank you so much, CL, for coming. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm also just like, wow, prominent.
Oh yes, and we'll definitely be talking about that. CL, can I give you the opportunity just to kind of introduce yourself a bit and tell
Yeah,
everyone who's not familiar with your work, perhaps, if there's anyone out there who's not, just about your writing and things like that?
sure. So I am a novelist and short story writer, short story editor, once upon a time, and I am most well known probably for my book series, The Magic of the Lost, which starts with The Unbroken and is followed by The Faithless, and eventually will be followed by The Sovereign, currently scheduled next year for April. And those that series is a anti-colonial trilogy inspired very loosely by the colonial relationship between France and North Africa, but also inspiration from other colonial and anti-colonial regimes and rebellions throughout history.
Wow, it's phenomenal. It was a fabulous book. I actually enjoyed it. Really touched me, got me in the feels. There were a lot of themes there that were very near and dear to my heart, and absolutely loved it. Definitely a recommended read for anyone who's out there. I cannot wait to get to the rest of the series. So I just want to confirm. So I know you've written book two. So you're in the
Mm-hmm.
process of writing book three. Is that correct?
Something like that. We've gone through a couple drafts, and I should be getting edits for a final draft soon. It's always really weird to kind of figure out how like editors are timing these things, partly because, you're not the only author in the stable, so everything else has to be staggered, which means your edits may, even though you've been done for a while, they may take a little bit more time to get to because somebody else's book is scheduled for before yours and all of that. But I also had to pause because of other secret projects that needed to be done. Yeah. And so, yeah, it just seemed easier to give me more time to really nail the third book and these other projects to just have an every other year kind of schedule for the books. So it's mostly done. I've definitely written full drafts of it. I know what's going to happen, and I'm excited for you guys to know what's going to happen. But yeah,
It's always fascinating to hear the behind the scenes of how books are made. I know PL and I also have a lot of friends in the indie scene, so we often talk about the difference between the two. Um, Not better, but different is kind of the way I like to
yeah,
look at
yeah.
it. So I love to hear how the trad side works. But it just, because we're talking about the difference between the second and the third book, I wanted to slide this
Mm-hmm.
question in before we move on, which is I've heard you say in previous interviews that the second book in a series is your favorite. And as someone who also holds the exact same unpopular opinion, that I often like second books or second movies in a series, I'm wondering what it is about the second book that you enjoy. And then a second question on top of that would be when you're writing the second book
Mm-hmm.
versus the third book, has there been a shift for you? Is there a difference because you enjoy one more than the other? So you can pick up any part of that you would like.
Yeah. So I guess I can't. I don't even know that I can say. I don't remember the context I would have been speaking in, but because I don't like every second book, I can be easily disappointed by a second book, like I think many people, or second movie. But when someone hits as a middle book or movie like really well, I think there's just like it's just so brilliant. Like there is nothing like that feeling of not hitting like a speed bump to slow you down and just like zooming right through and feeling the heightening of all the characters, the heightening of all of the stakes in the series. So for me, I was really actually I was sweating bullets when I was trying to write the second book because I wanted to do that, you know. And I ended up reading I ended up reading or not reading. It was a class that Fonda Lee of the Jade City series did about writing trilogies, and I was like, well, she did okay, so I might as well just learn from her, you know. And she said a lot of things that kind of like they seem pretty basic, like, oh, you know, treat each book like a standalone in some ways, like it needs to have its own arc, and like that's pretty obvious at face value, but the way she broke it down made me re-see the entire trilogy anew. And one of the things that I really liked that she said that resonated with me was you should choose some way to make each book bigger or change scope in some way. And so, like with her series, she was changing like the world slash generational scope. So her series goes like the characters get notably older. Like we see generations of this family. So it's more of a family saga. And so with mine, I think what I ended up doing is making the empire bigger. Like, so we have Khazal alone with like hints of other people, other places in the Unbroken. And if you haven't read the book, the Khazal is the colonized country. And the second book, we go to Baladare, which is the imperial country. And we still have some Khazal and some of the outskirts of other colonies. And then the third, well, we're going to get a little bigger, spend a little bit more time with people from other places, and just you're seeing more of the world, I think, is how I decided to go with it. But the second one was just really hard to write because I didn't know where I wanted to go with the story. I knew what I wanted the end to be, but since I sent when I sent my proposal to sell the book, I was actually originally thinking 2 books, and they said we'll take 3 books, and I was like, oh, what do I do for an extra book? And so I had to figure out how I was going to extend the story beyond what I had originally envisioned without making it feel, you know, just like fluffed for an extra book. I'll let you guys tell me how I did later, but I ended up being really happy with the second book, how it turned out.
Well, I can tell you the first book was absolutely marvelous. I want to put up a quick comment from Shade Tree Reads. Fantastic, great to see you. She says,
Hi,
"Oh my
Deidre.
God, never been happier to be an early bird." Hey y'all, yeah, wonderful, wonderful person.
Good morning.
Check out her channel, YouTube channel. She does so fantastic stuff. I can definitely say the first book was absolutely outstanding. I can see why it's garnered so much acclaim and had you nominated for so many awards. I want to mention that in all, I couldn't help but see some of the reviews, CL, that you had for the book. One of them was from Peter Jelly Clark, who is another author that Taylor and I both love. He graced us with his presence on the channel in the past.
Nice.
And one comment he made in his review was that Terrain is a heroine we need in these times. I completely agree, but I'd love to hear CL and maybe hear you talk a bit about your main character. What do you think about that comment and how it relates to how you feel about Terrain? Because I felt she was like just an incredible character.
I mean, I think the most important thing about her for me in writing her and envisioning her, when I first had the idea for her character, I was just thinking, I had this vision of a woman who is killing her own people, and like she's executing them. That the very first scene I ever had of the book was actually the first, like the hanging scene, except it wasn't a hanging scene, it was a firing squad. And so it changed a little bit from that initial vision, but that was always the first scene. And the thing about Terrain, and the thing that I was so interested in exploring, is that she is so many of us who are marginalized but still in some sort of position of power, and we all have some kind of culpability, some sort of complicity that we need to deal with, we need to be aware of, as we go through our lives, because every choice that we make within these systems is going to have an impact on not just, like, what kind of person we want to be, but the material world. Like, other people will be impacted by our decisions, and that was the most important thing to explore to me. And I think, like, I also love P. Djeli Clark, and so I'm really honored to see that he said that, just because to know that Terrain resonates with people in a sort of necessary way, that I envisioned her, because I think a lot of us are Terrains, a lot of us are Lucas, and not everybody is actually paying attention to where they might fall and where their duties lie, in terms of what subject position they're in.
Yeah, I definitely feel you there. Sorry, Taylor, go ahead. You had a
Oh
question.
no, it's fine. My eyes are sparkling. You couldn't match more in our tastes, because Clark and Lee are two of my favorite authors, like, of all time. So I'm on the same wavelength as you there. But I do think that having main characters that are a wish fulfillment of sorts is an important thing to have in stories at times. But I think when you can see even the worst parts of yourself reflected in a character, I often talk about fantasy as a mirror. So it allows us to look at ourselves, but from a safe enough distance that we don't run away from what we see, as we might if we're looking, at something that's a real world example, even if it deals with the same themes. So do you find when you were writing Terrain that you were doing a little bit of self-reflection as well? Because she sounds like not just a vessel. I don't want to say that, because I feel like she probably has agency of her own accord, in her story. But she sounds like a way to, like I said, have that mirror to look back at some of the issues we may have in our world. So was it difficult to write her at times, trying to kind of do that reflective nature, that part of her?
I think it can be difficult to make sure I'm being honest about her decisions. And I mean, like, I don't know that it was hard for me to write, but I think it's hard for people to read, because I've seen some of the less flattering reviews, where people are like, "Oh my gosh, she's so stupid," and I'm like, "Well, so are you." I mean, we all are. We all make really dumb decisions sometimes. Like, it's hard to make the right decision when you're in the middle of something, and so that is it's hard to be misunderstood sometimes, like, as a writer, like what you're trying to do. But I don't actually think that she was hard as a character to write for that reason. There were other difficulties, like giving her more agency, actually, because she is, she's a soldier, she's bound to follow orders, but she also feels very disenfranchised. And so some of the challenges in writing her were about keeping her involved as an agent in the story, and not someone who is continually blown away or blown around, by powers higher than her. Or if she is being blown around, paying very close attention to the little decisions that she makes for herself and what ripple effects those have down the line.
Yes, and I know that I have to say, like, Terrain's character just spoke to me. I think the hardest thing for me reading that character was, while it's easy to feel like, oh no, I'm, and for my background being in law enforcement, I'm more self-aware of the decisions I'm consciously making, and how that fits in with my actually being marginalized. But then what Terrain did is made me call into question so many things I've done, and how I saw myself, and how I saw where I fit in a law enforcement agency, and as a marginalized person, and the things I dealt with, and the challenges I had, and reading her made me start to re-examine that with a different lens.
Mm-hmm.
And it was frankly, it was a bit chilling. A really great exercise, and a really valuable and unique exercise, but there were moments where yeah, it gave me the chills internally, and I won't say I didn't shed a tear or two, just feeling for her,
Mm-hmm.
and also, some self-pity, I think, and feeling for people in that position, and what that looks like. I think the main difference between, for example, I'm not comparing us, between someone like Terrain and say myself, is that I felt I had a really good founded and grounded sense of my own history, of my genealogy, of being proud to be who I am and to be what I look like.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Terrain, she was struggling with a lot of that, the ignorance in terms of, and in some ways almost a willful
Mm-hmm.
ignorance of not wanting to associate herself with her past, because she
Mm-hmm.
felt that was an impediment to her future. And I
Yeah.
thought that was so exceptionally done. I wrote in my review, I felt like it felt at times reading like she was crumbling under the pressure of wanting to belong,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in that sense, she became more isolated. And her own people who are more conscious, more aware, they see her as a sellout, even though she was snatched. I don't want to give these
Yeah.
spoilers,
Yeah.
but it's a lot of it. So much of it isn't her fault, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just watching that journey, like self-discovery, identity, and mindfulness, it was fascinating, but it was heart-wrenching.
Yeah, one
So
of the things I liked exploring, especially as we get into the second and third books and she gets a little bit more autonomy, is exactly when do things become her fault and when are they not? Like how much can she blame on Balladeer? When is she no longer Balladeer's instrument? And when is she her own? And thus when does she have to take responsibility for the choices she's made and the new things she's done? To either side, because you know some stuff's gonna happen and it's not really gonna be great for others. But she has to actually like pay attention to what is done for duty and what is done for her own desire, and duty to whom is something that she's gonna keep worrying over that particular question for a long time.
Yeah, I feel like it's such a difficult thing when you are working within a power structure that doesn't like you. And yet you have
Mm-hmm.
to find a way to function to, there's a level of selfishness that's not a bad thing. Self-preservation is
Mm-hmm.
something that we all have. But at what point can you become altruistic? At what point are you able to look outside of yourself? I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
huge theme. To tackle. And I just want to say
Yeah.
props to you for taking that on. And just to kind of add a broader scope into it, I know that you are originally from the States, forgive me if I'm wrong, but then you moved
Mm-hmm.
to across the pond to England. And as someone else well, I'm in the States now, but my home base is Japan at this point. And so as someone else who's decided by choice to live in a culture that is not the one I've grown up in, it teaches you a lot. Nothing will humble you quicker. Nothing will teach you about yourself quicker than living in a culture that's not the one you grew up in. And
Mm-hmm.
while those are more, I guess, mild examples, of course, than Turin's experience, I wonder if you think making that choice to live in a place that is not, your origin, do you think that that had an effect on the way that you wrote Turin's story at all? Or was she pretty straightforward in how you wanted to write her and the perspectives you wanted to show?
I think that the England part was actually probably not the one that had the bigger impact on me. Though I did, so I live in London now, and I actually lived here for a couple years during my high school time as well. So I've come back, but when I really think about it, I think a lot of her experiences are experiences I knew from when I was still in high school in the States with friends. Like, I had a lot of friends, for example, who were like second, third generation Mexican kids who either spoke Spanish but couldn't read it or write it, or they didn't speak it at all because their parents wouldn't speak to them in Spanish. And so, in order to have a quote unquote better life, they had like completely cut that entirely, or cut some aspect of it entirely from themselves or from their children. And so that is part of it. Also, I'm a Black American, which means there is some genealogy that I have no idea about and could never ever trace back, just because I don't have the records. My family doesn't have the records to go back that far. And so there is definitely stuff that I felt or was aware of or was just sort of, simmering inside my head. But then there's also just like the history. Like I studied post-colonial literature, post-colonial history when I was in college as well. And a lot of the Francophone African writers who were writing in French, or writers who are writing in English, writing about how they know exactly what they're doing and writing in French. In a sense, they're not actually writing to their own people. They're writing to French people. And what kind of doublespeak that becomes. Similarly for code switching in the United States for anybody, but specifically in my case, like for Black Americans, like what languages you speak to power, what languages you end up bringing back home. And I think all of that has more to do with how I wrote Terrain going back home than moving to England, to be honest. Though, I guess for me, England doesn't feel quite so different. But I did live in Taiwan for a year, and that sort of abrupt shift of everything. I could definitely see how that might have gotten into some of the Terrain perspective.
Yeah, I and Taylor, I want to let you get your question shortly. I just want to put up a quick shout out to Daniel, great friend of the channel. Good morning, Dan. Thanks for getting up so early. I'm sure you were really motivated seeing that CL Clark was coming on. But yeah, so thanks for joining us. Sorry, Taylor, go ahead.
Oh no, it was more of a comment rather than a specific question. But I do think that a lot of the points that you mentioned about being part of a diaspora it has so much nuance to it, especially in a place like the States where there's such a mixing of different diasporas coming together. I was also very lucky to go to a school that had a lot of different cultures that were mixed together in high school. And I definitely saw a lot of what you've mentioned. And the idea that your roots are a threat to the place that you live in now, I think is such a horrible thing that is perpetuated in so many ways in so many places. The fact that it's not a new thing that history can be threatening. People play with history all the time to make that obvious. But I wanted to say that the way that you just spoke about those issues makes it clear to me that I think you've completely sold me on the Unbroken, by the way. I'm the only one in the world, I think, that hasn't read it yet. But hearing those personal stories really makes me want to see how you put them on the page, because I've seen exactly everything that you've just mentioned firsthand. And it's, again, a lot to tackle, but I love when people tackle big things in the book. So I'm so excited to see what you have to say about it. Truly.
Well, I mean, I definitely, I'm not done. I'm not like, I was joking with a friend because I was writing another story, and I was like, this feels actually like I'm just rewriting the Unbroken. And she was like, you know what? There's like gonna be in like 20 years somebody who's just studying your work, and because of that they're going to have a great PhD thesis because your works have themes. You have a through line in your work, and so that's kind of what I'm just gonna keep working over these same things over and over again, until I figure out, or don't figure out. Somebody else in 20 years will figure out what I'm trying to say about them and come to some conclusion. But
I think it's definitely thesis material for sure. As,
Yeah, that was one of my questions. Was I heard you also say in previous interviews that it began as a thesis. The Unbroken began as a thesis, and obviously it has developed into the juggernaut of the fantasy genre that it is today. But I'm wondering how that shift happened to go from academia to public consumption. Like, what were the steps? Walk us through that process.
Oh, well, first I should say that it was always a creative thesis. So it wasn't like an academic essay type thing. But it started in undergrad when I was taking 3 classes. I was taking a post-colonial, well, it was a general sort of survey literary theory course, but the resonant part for me was the post-colonial literary theory for my English classes. I was taking my Francophone African Lit course for my French side of my degree, and then I was doing an independent study on violent women in fiction, specifically fantasy. That was my interest. And all 3 of those together, I had that vision of terrain and the firing squad, and I told my advisor for the independent study that I'm gonna write this book. And so I gave her the first chapter, and that was in like 2012. And I didn't go to grad school immediately after, but I did finish the book the next year, and I knew that I wanted to work on that in grad school when I went. And yeah, so when I finished, I had to turn in like a book length thing, and that's what I turned in for my graduate thesis.
I apologize. My internet cut out for a moment there, but I caught most of what you said. I do apologize for that. Yeah. But I mean, I find that fascinating, though, that you were able to take all of these concepts that you learned in the classroom and make it such a publicly applicable thing. I feel like there's a way to do more academic, even though you say it's a creative thesis, there's definitely like an academic speak, an academic way to present those ideas that can be, that doesn't lend itself to wider reading. So I just love that you were able to take that into a wider reading, to put some fancy words around it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've also read those essays too. So
to see your baby out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that part never gets old. To see people reading it, like carrying it around, looking at it in bookstores. If I would go to a bookstore, sometimes I'm like, see, like someone's looking at it on the shelf, and I'm like, oh my god. Sometimes if they like actually,
good as you walk past.
Sometimes I say like, and if I see them actually buy it, I'll be like, hey, I'll sign that for you if you want. No one's ever said no.
Oh my gosh, what would they?
I know some people don't like signed books, so. But it's pretty cool. I think.
I haven't met them.
Not here. Not these two hosts anyways.
I mean, I can send you guys some book plates.
Oh my gosh, seriously?
Oh yeah, easy.
Oh, you're so generous.
The sparkle in his eyes, you just made his day, CL.
Be honored. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, we can do that for sure. We'll talk later. We'll talk. One of the coolest, wildest things is fan art. Like, especially like there are people I know who have like jobs, like their job is to do art, and then they just do like silly art that they're not going to get paid for of my characters, and I'm like, that's amazing. It's like, and it's always so good. It's so like getting to see the different ways people envision the characters, or like making little cartoons of them. Like one of my favorites is there's an artist, Rebby-esque. She put the name in the chat if I can. The private chat anyway, and then you guys can share it. It's something like that. Rebiesque, something like that. And she's on Instagram and Twitter, and she has taken memes, like common memes from TikTok and stuff, and drawn my characters as these little cartoons. So if you have been on TikTok during the baked bean era, you can get Sabine, who is one of the characters from The Faithless, and Terrain, who is shorter than a few of the other characters, including Sabine, who is supposed to be this sort of Amazonian tall woman who basically, she, like Terrain says, "Oh, you're really tall," and Sabine says, "Well, you look like a baked bean." and so this artist drew that exchange, and that's in the meme. It's not in the book. No one is called a baked bean in the books. There's also a Luca cartoon where she's doing the croissant meme. So if you know the croissant meme, then there's Luca and Terrain in that as well. And those bring me great joy.
Oh my gosh, that's so phenomenal. Yeah, it just must make you feel, as a writer, just, when people are so enamored by your book, they're doing all this, the fan art, the fan fiction, and all these things that just show how much they love it. And I think that's probably a really special feeling. I want to quickly pop a few comments. That was just saying that the fact that his angry cat woke him up for food, but that catching this live was a happy byproduct. And Shade Tree agrees. My two feline overlords don't realize it's the weekend. Daniel had a quick comment regarding your area of study, CL. Says, I have a friend who studies French West African literature. Don't have anything relevant to add, but rather unusual, so found it notable. And he said that that friend wrote a book called The Afrofuturisms, Ecology, Humanity, and Francophone Culture Expressions. And I can understand almost none of it. But I'm always hats off to people who, first of all, like Taylor and yourself, CL, who are bilingual or multilingual. I have zero head for languages, so I think people like that their intellect is on another level, because I could never do that. So, but yeah, that whole area does sound fascinating. I want to quickly mention, while CL, you had left off kind of quickly speaking about Luca. Luca, the other character in the book, we haven't even spoken about her yet. I think for me, she was compelling, obviously. And it was that dichotomy. I'll tell you what the main thing for me was about her in a minute. But yeah, that dichotomy, she's, in some ways, she's so sensitive, she's so insightful. She's striving to make herself worthy of leadership. A lot of that strategic and her own ambition, but she tries to be forward and progressive thinking, but a lot of times, obviously, she isn't. She wants to, she's trying to be collaborative and use negotiation, and she's very, I think she's very courageous in coping with her disability. And there's a sensitivity there, and there's a spirituality, and excuse me, there's some very attractive features of her makeup, and there's of the makeup of her character, and there's not some not so attractive features. But what reading Luca Raid really made me think about, what does it mean? And obviously, this isn't why she's doing what she's doing, but it becomes part of, for me anyways, the story. What it means to be an ally, what it means to be someone who is going to show the fortitude, the bravery, to support someone who is marginalized, support in this case a whole people who are marginalized, and become the leader of those people. What does that all mean? And how, actually, for the first time, I think maybe reading your book in my life, and this is one of the things that your book really did for me, is what does it mean for that person who wants to be an ally to someone who's marginalized, and what's the cost for them potentially to do that? And was that something that you had consciously worked in as a theme in the book, or was that something, a byproduct that just came up kind of inadvertently?
Oh no, that was definitely part of it. I think where so this entire book started because I really wanted to write a bodyguard royal romance. Like I just wanted that trope in the book, but the more that I was in my studies and the more that I was just like sitting with the truth of what this book would have to mean, given where Terrain was from, where Luca was from, I just knew that I had to go deeper than that, which meant I then had to actually really look at Luca's motivations. I had to look at like who she was as a person, and I did. There was a draft that was just like straight up evil Luca, and I liked that, but it wasn't. It didn't end up being what I wanted it to be. Like there were things that I wanted in the ending that couldn't have happened with evil Luca. So one day I will rewrite a book that is not the Unbroken, but might feel kind of like the Unbroken, but it will have evil Luca. It's like the alternate universe version. But yeah, no, it was I think it was a natural byproduct of what it means to actually explore these two characters, their worlds, their subject positions, and also the different positions that we find ourselves in. Like everyone is very happy to support anti-colonialism until it actually impacts them and their own privilege, which we see a lot with Palestine right now. Like it's like people who have been predominantly progressive. There's even a book called Except for Palestine. It's about people who are progressive except for Palestine. And Luca is very progressive except for her own colony. If she loses her colony, then she loses everything that makes her the queen or the princess or whatever. Like it makes her royal. And if she loses that, then she loses standing. Everything that she's taken for granted up to this point, she would lose it, which is why so much of the question of what we're willing to give up, it's not so much like a price she pays, but in my head, it's more like, it's not even a sacrifice. I mean, she sees it as a sacrifice, but it's just, it was already taken. So like, how much of what was taken will you give back? And that's the question that we continue to ask through the series, is like, how much will you give to be an ally? How close are you willing for this alliance to be? Or is it like just a very shallow kind of acquaintanceship sort of alliance? Like we can be allies up to a point, but at some point we will be back to war. And so
yeah, I love the idea of writing an alternative version of that where Luca is not who she is now, because I think that's one of my favorite things to explore is what different influences or lack thereof can do to a character. So, you know, it's very big in the zeitgeist right now, but the Avatar series is getting its reboot. But I love the original cartoon. One of the things I love about it is the way that Zuko's character explores what having a good father figure could do versus, you know, sorry for people who I'm spoiling for, but versus Azula.
it's been so long.
Yeah, versus Azula. Who doesn't have that father figure, and seeing what a huge difference that makes having a foil in that way. So I feel like writing that, not only would your fans eat that shit up, I'm sure, but I feel like it would really add to the conversation of where Luca is now as a character. But I did want to bring these two characters we've now talked about together. Is it a spoiler to talk about the romantic aspect of this story? because people who
I
yell
don't
about
think
it.
so.
Okay, all right. So even myself, who has not yet read the Unbroken, I'm well aware that Terrain and Luca, there's a romantic aspect to their relationship. And when I hear people talk about your book, it's the romance is a key point that I hear about. I hear about the themes, I hear about the romance, and then including the second book, The Faithless, I hear people talk about your action, which I know that you actually practice swordplay, which is amazing, and I would love to ask you about that after. But as someone who has been entrenched in the fantasy genre for most of my reading life, romance has, there's some people don't like that. I think it's changing in recent years, but if there was a time when a lot of readers would hear it has a romance and they'd be like, yeah, not for me. I'm not going to touch that. So I'm wondering if you felt any of the pushback wanting to make the romance a key part of the story, because I feel like from the way I've heard people talk about it, their romantic interaction is so key to you playing with those themes that you talked about, having these two subjective realities interact with each other on the interpersonal level is what makes it work so well, because it's not all large scale. So it sounds very key to the story. So I'm wondering, did you get any pushback when you pitched that aspect of it?
Oh no, not at all.
That's great news. We've come so far.
No one said anything about it. And it was also like, I thought maybe like I might have to fight a little bit because it was going to be queer, but then Gideon came out the year before, and then Priory of the Orange Tree, and those were all selling like buckets. So then I was like, oh, this isn't a problem. We're done. That part's this will sell fine because of the lesbians. Everyone will buy it because of the lesbians. It's fine. But it is interesting to consider where the romance, like how much of a role the romance plays in the packaging of the book from a marketing standpoint, as well as just like a narrative standpoint, because of the rise in romantasy now. Because it's just something that a lot of us who even write with like even like vague threads of romance in a book, like it's just the new kind of packaging is making us all hyper aware as publishers try to be like, well, let's put this over here. Especially if you're like a female writer, they're going to be like, well, we're not going to call it YA anymore. Now we're going to call it romantasy. And so we're all kind of in that situation, and that hasn't happened to me yet. And I think there are a lot of different things that could be going on with that. But I do wonder, because I've never, I don't consider it to be a very heavy romantic plot in such a way that it would be called romantasy, because that is not the central question of the books. Like it seems to be is the qualifying factor for a romantasy book. And yet it is one of the central motors of the story. And yes, the power dynamics that we're exploring are the power dynamics of lovers, but also the power dynamics of a society, and what that means for each person, each person's attached nations, just the political game of if I give you this, and this is my body in this case, not necessarily like gold or a political decision, but if I give you this, will you give me that, and that kind of question. And maybe that's part of the reason it's not quite romantasy, is because it's kind of a really fucked up relationship that they have. Sorry, am I allowed to say that?
I already cursed. I opened the door. Go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so it's definitely there are a lot of reviews that talk about how problematic the relationship is, and I'm like, yeah, it is. So what? What are we going to do with it now? Like, that is the question. So yeah, I'm really interested in continuing to explore complicated romantic situations. But yeah, no pushback so far.
I'm sure Taylor has a lot to say about that. I just want to quickly say, because obviously I've read the book. I loved your book. That was probably the most frustrating part for me about the book, and not because the romance wasn't exceptionally done, and not because I mean Taylor knows me. I love romance and fantasy. I think it's part of life. It's part of something that should be there. It adds to realism, and I like my romance in my fantasy, and I think that was probably, and it was frustrating because it was so tantalizing, and I think the issue for me was like and I'm sure and obviously I write, so I get it. I said this is just something that's probably going to be explored more in the next book, but I want to see more of it now, right? So I think that was my frustration. Again, I think I wrote my view that this isn't the author's issue how she wrote it. It was amazing, right? This is mine. I was looking for like because it was burgeoning, it was slow burn, um, and I think for both of them, they were waiting to see. They were both wondering where this was going to go, but really not sure because of all the complexities. So, anyways, that was just my comment, and I'll shut
Yeah,
up now.
no, it needed. I took so long with it because they had a very complicated dynamic, and this was part of the evil Luca thread was in with evil Luca. They boned a lot sooner because Luca didn't care about Terrain's autonomy. She was just like, yeah, you're my servant. We're gonna have sex, and it changes the dynamics completely of that relationship. And so, for this reason or another, I decided that wasn't the way we were gonna play this particular relationship, and so yeah, that's the book that never was. But yeah.
Well, romance is such, as PL, just said, romance is such a part of life. I feel like it's, you're remiss to write it off as something that's not important. And it's a main motivating factor for people the world over. I mean, love makes you do crazy shit. We all accept that. So, but something else I've heard you say before is that you want to start a course where sex scenes and fight scenes are the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to give you a platform to pitch that, one. And two, just say that's awesome to hear. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that? Why would you like to make a course with that title?
Because they're really fun, and they are almost like, if you just really sit and just break them down, they are like almost the exact same thing. They are bits of flesh contact. Sometimes there are other implements, not always, and heightened emotions or numbed emotions, like that's still part of the same category. And you have to weave the two of those together somehow in a way that is appealing, or at least like thematically jarring if you don't want it to be appealing. And then, depending on your school of thought, somehow all of that should be moving either the story or the characters along. And it's messy, potentially. Yeah, so in that way they're really similar, and I think it's just really fun. I like to write both types of scenes. They require choreography, both of them.
I can see you're trying to be careful with your words here, not to go into.
No, well, it's more like, I just like, if I were actually going to pitch this as a class, I would say it's going to be a character class. Because when I'm doing both of these scenes, it's part choreography, but mostly it's how do you make sure you don't lose the character who is doing these things in this moment. So why is this significant to the character? Like, in that case, why are we showing it at all? Because you can do a boot scene, as like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman used to call it, or like a summary of a fight or a battle. If it's not really important, if it's just like a thing that happened, you just say it happened and move on. If you're gonna be in it, then it's about character more than anything. So
I think and I think that's phenomenal. Just the concept of writing, of that being a course, like I know for me as an author, and I find that the commonality between those two things is that they're two of the things that are most commonly complained about by readers, depending on subjectively your taste, of being gratuitous. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, I know for me, for example, the last book that I wrote, I've always wanted to include more romance, more love, and it could only be when it's, as you said, CL, part of driving the plot. There had to be a reason for it, right? But it's something I enjoy writing, and I enjoy
Mm-hmm.
writing battle scenes. It's not, I don't get as much of a gist out of it, but I enjoy them. Yet
Mm-hmm.
I find that, I know in this book, if some readers, you could see more readers should be reading the series. Some of them who weren't into the romance, they came out and said, "Oh, this is a bit more spicy than this last book is a bit more spicy than I enjoy or that I'm used to, right?" And some of them were like, "Oh
Mm-hmm.
my gosh, this is amazing! I was waiting for the spice, and please bring
Mm-hmm.
more on, right?" Because they're well written.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's funny how those two things are polarizing in a way, in terms of, when people feel, well, this is gratuitous, this is too much, even if it's integral to the plot, even if it moves the story forward, even if it means something. I think those are two of the elements in fantasy specifically that some people want, but what really makes me fascinated is that, and Taylor, you've read a lot more in the romancy milieu than I have, and you probably have a lot of great insights into this as well. And of course, see how, like, I know that it seems like for the most part, people can handle X amount of gore, evisceration, beheading on the page, and it's kind of like, maybe it's because we're conditioned to it. It's like, but you throw in a really spicy sex scene, and a lot of people are jarred. And again, it's subjective, but that's what I find for the ones that read the more traditional epic fantasy. You can litter the pages with dead bodies, but if you you throw romance in there, it's so a lot of people find it jarring. So I'm not sure how you two feel about that, but that's what I've found.
I just think people want to complain about something. I just, I yeah. I
I
have
think
so
there's
I have
that,
so
but
little. Yeah. Go ahead.
well, no, I mean, I agree basically with what both of you said, but I think it's different in different societies, but definitely in the States, in the West, sex is taboo, but violence is not. Like Marvel movies, I mean, it's just like cartoonized violence, but we don't get intimate scenes, don't have the same weight, in our popular media. And this is just my opinion, of course. I have zero evidence for this, like actual hard evidence, but I think that carries over into the way that we read stories as well. Because I definitely agree with you, Piela. There's a definite sensitivity to sex scenes or intimate scenes that there isn't to violence. And with the rise of grimdark, I am a grimdark lover myself, but I do think that the threshold for what is violent has also shifted over the years, at least in the fantasy genre, the fantasy fantasy genre. But yeah, so I definitely had the exact same observation that you had, PL. And this is a little bit of a different topic, but I giggled while you were talking, PL, not because of what you were saying, but because of Daniel's comment, which says that Ken Liu knows all about just telling us that a battle happened. And I had to chuckle at that, because Ken Liu is another favorite author of mine, the Danielian Dynasty. And yeah, he does that a lot. But I think there's a way to do that still keeps you engaged. So I don't want that to turn anyone away, but I had to chuckle.
I read the first two of that series. I really liked them. I haven't gotten to the other ones yet, but
yeah, Wall
really
of
good.
Storms is probably one of my favorite books, but I could go on about that forever, so we won't do that. But Daniel seems to have some great comments here. Can you imagine if those cultural ideas were reversed? What if violence was utterly taboo, but Marvel movies had cartoonish sexuality? What would that even look like?
Actually, I would say there was an article that I have thought about a lot, and which makes me say this is probably actually true. Marvel movies also have cartoonish sexuality. The article is called something like "Everybody is sexy and nobody's having sex" or something like that. Everybody's beautiful and nobody's having sex. About how we super hypersexualize everybody, like men have to be like rippling pectorals, bigger than they've ever been, just like muscles on top of the muscles on top of the muscles. These sexy women with their boobs out but not actually having sex usually. Like everything's hypersexualized, but we're not actually allowed to talk about the intimacy itself. And so, and I think that is quite cartoonish actually. So maybe that's what it looks like.
That's a really good point. And I do wonder, this is just speculation at this point, but if there's, talking about the fantasy genre specifically, if it's a carryover from it being a boys' club, because, you know, we talked about romantasy and the fact that women authors are usually shoehorned into YA. And there's just a different view between if the, you know, what gender the author is. So I wonder if it could be a kind of leftover, a ripple effect of that.
That's what I think sometimes. And now I would be curious to see, because like I'm a huge Joe Abercrombie fan, and I actually love his sex scenes. Like they are the most natural, real, like squidgy, like people laughing, people sticking wrong things in wrong holes. Like it is. And it was brilliant. Like guys accidentally finding out they like being slapped by their wives. Like it's just like every sex scene is great. And they're not like they're not erotica by any means. Which I love erotica in its own, but this is not. I'm saying that not pejoratively, but like they're not titillating in that way. They're just like really ridiculous bits of humanity. And so I wonder, like, do people complain about his sex scenes? I feel like the answer is no. And he has a lot of them. So yeah, I definitely think sexism is certainly part of it. But or homophobia. Like I hear a lot of people complain about like gay men writing gay sex scenes in like the literary world as well. So.
I'm so glad you brought up Joe Abercrombie, because when I've only read the first two books and the first Law, but no one ever talked about the fact that there were sex scenes ever. So when one popped up, I was like, why is everyone always talks about the fact that there's spice.
Oh, those books are so horny.
Yeah. And I'm like, why is this not an aspect of the conversation? I hear character, but I never hear about characters having sex with each other, but that happens all the time. So I was surprised in the sense that I had never heard it talked about when it popped up, you know?
I think that's such an amazing point that both you brought up. And yeah, and Abercrombie specifically, because I read the first, first trilogy, the first Law, and now the Age of Madness trilogy. And as CL hit it on the head, Joe Abercrombie disarms you with this feeling of the only word I can think of it is the realness, the realism, the raw, the naturalness of the entire situation. Not so much the act where somebody's stinky, they haven't showered in days, you know what I mean? Yep. They're rusty, they haven't had sexy beers, this aspect of making people who perhaps feel uncomfortable about seeing sex on the pages, maybe even take the back to the fact that this is a very human act that is not always set perfectly, where, like CL said, the person is all ripped with really buffed, and maybe they haven't worked out ages, and the bellies were protruding, and they're not like I think the fact that Abercrombie disarms us and shows us that, hey, this is something that it's not about the perfection of the people or the act. It's more about that connection, that human connection. I think that's what I love about his scenes, and it's fantastic you brought that up, because I always thought about that, like why does nobody ever complain about how much, like, just as Taylor said, like how much sex is in Abercrombie's book, and because he essentially disarms it and perhaps makes us feel better about ourselves, because not everyone is, as CL said, has a six-pack, and and that maybe a lot of the subconscious things that we worry about when we're about to get into it with somebody, that like I just think a lot of those elements he throws in there, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's fantastic. So
Yeah, and I mean
fantastic.
it's in all the books, even his younger series. Because I've read actually he's probably one of the only people I've read through almost everything, and his like younger series also has it, and it's because I think it's geared slightly toward younger readers. Potentially, I don't even know if it's billed as YA or if it's just young characters in adult fiction. I don't know where people shelve it, but even that is a very real situation because it's these two characters' first time, and it's so super super awkward, kind of adorable, like oh good for you guys, but also like you have no idea what you're doing. And so even in that situation, there's just like a verisimilitude along with the tenderness. So yeah.
That's amazing. While we're quick on that topic, I know it's going to lead to something that Taylor wants to talk about. So I just want to hit up so quickly because it is something that's burned me. So for me, yeah, believe it or not, there was a time I was in really good shape. I got the pictures to prove it, believe it or not. So Taylor is still quite buffed. I know Taylor, you were a lifter. I remember you posting something after, I think not too long after Samir was born, and you went back to the gym and you were doing either some deadlifts or something. And yeah, like I know working out was a big part. Being athletic was a big part of my life, playing football, at sports, all sports, and for Taylor as well. So it's something I think that's near and dear to our hearts. CL, you're obviously still very buff. I love watching your posts about all the workout stuff, and so for me, I know that, and now this bleeds into my job and how I write battle scenes and my experience with confrontations
Mm-hmm.
in the context of my job. And say for someone like Taylor with, at that background, I think Taylor, I think you were a soccer player. Soccer's a tough sport. Like, Sia, how does the physicality of you as a person, obviously you work out a lot and you're in great shape, but how does that play into your writing? Things like when you're writing, you have some fantastic action scenes in the Unbroken, and I hear going forward in the next books. How does that all, what you do, how does it play into, your writing?
Very heavily. I even so if you know May Robinette Kowal, she's got a little section of her website that she dedicates to people writing about my favorite bit. So they talk about their favorite bit of whatever book they're releasing. And the one that I wrote for when I was publishing the Unbroken, it was about physicality in the story. And all of my writing, I'm always very attuned to characters and how they relate to their bodies, to other people's bodies, just because I am very aware of mine, how it does really good things, how it does really shitty things, how it's broken, how it's building, what it can do for other people, what is the point of, whether it's aesthetic demands that I'm making of it, whether it's strength demands, and the sociology that goes with it, or the psychology that goes with those decisions to change your body in one way or another, some sort of affirming way, or sometimes a non-affirming way, depending on what the case may be. And so I also find it really interesting to explore that kind of stuff in a speculative setting. Like, if you can change your body with magic, or using this power will degrade your body, like, what would that feel like? How far would you go? What is the exchange worth? And so that's probably something that I will, again, it's going to serve some PhD student really well one day in the future, because it's a huge part of myself and how I navigate the world, how I examine and analyze it. But also, yeah, it means that I'm really interested in like physical activities, like sword play and stuff. And so when I have to figure out how characters are doing something, I have a pretty strong idea of how bodies move. I've taken loads of anatomy classes and stuff. And so I know that you cannot say that somebody punched somebody in such a way that actually means their elbow should be over there and the other person should be over there. So that's not going to work. So it does help with that kind of choreography as well. And I also know how long it should take somebody to go from being a complete novice at a weapon or a martial arts to being a master. Like, that's not the kind of thing that happens in the span of a book, unless it's a, decades long book. So.
Very much so. It takes a long time. I dabbled in boxing in university, and let me say I did not learn as much as I thought in that short period of time. There's a lot more to be learned. So I definitely, like I said, you already sold me on your book, but I love when a character sucks at something that they start and then they slowly get better at it. So, because it's a reflection of reality. And I also love the comment that you made about the connection between the mind and body. I think people, it's not everyone, but I think it is in general societally lost a bit, the connection between the way that you connect with your body and the way that affects your mental health. I think that's super key. But I did want to go a little bit more to a writing question, if you'll follow me here. You mentioned in the beginning of this interview that you wrote more short stories. You were kind of in that realm before you took on writing the Unbroken and your current, large series. So when you, Clark is a good example of this. When you approach short fiction versus long fiction, I feel like there's a very different way to approach those kinds of stories. And world building is different. What you're able to show is different. And what makes a good piece of work is different. So when you go to approach the different types of writing, what is your approach for both of them? If you know you're going to write a short story or you're going to write a longer epic.
It depends on if I do know what my length parameters are. Like if I just want to play around and an idea comes first, or I play a lot with the story engine cards, the story engine decks, and so sometimes I'm just like, oh, what could these be? And I don't have a specific length in mind. I might just be playing like, oh, I'm interested in this. I had a little kernel of an idea last night, and I was trying to figure out, like, is this a book or is this a short story? And part of it, in answering that question, is how much scope does this story have? Like there's something that I feel like I like people who work in tech will understand, because there's always a scope of a project, and is this going to add to the scope, or will we still be done in time? And sometimes being done in time is like, that's the key question. Like, sometimes someone will ask me, hey, I want something from you. It needs to be 5,000 to 7,000 words. And that is my scope. So I have to find a story that will fit that, which means finding a seed and then kind of pruning it. Because, like, if I think long enough about anything, I'm sure I could expand it and expand it and expand it. Like, I could turn this trilogy into an epic if I wanted to. Like, all you have to do is just keep seeing, okay, well, then what next? Then what next? Then what next? With a short story, you just have to stop asking what next, and or not stop asking, but you leave it open, and you circumscribe less of it for the reader. And I have some things that I know I want to go either way. And so maybe they'll start as a short story, but then I'll make a novel that will explore all the things that we are just sort of starting. Like, I'm working on a short story right now that I think this particular moment is definitely a short story. However, it is the beginning of a series of adventures. It is how two characters meet, and that exchange, that little mini adventure they go on together, that cements a friendship, or at least we will travel together for now kind of moment. And then that could lead into being like a chapter in a book if I wanted to go that far. But if I come up with an idea and I'm like, I want this to be a short story, but it has this huge world around it, then it's really just about picking a moment that has changed for a character or that has changed something for a character, and writing around that and just holding it to that boundary. It's possible, of course, to write really long time frames in a short story, but it just really just depends on what you want to do with the narrative itself.
That sense of this is a short story or this has the potential to be a long form content, is that something you've developed over time? Do you think you've gotten better at recognizing an idea and saying, this is a short story idea for sure?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with practice, and I've seen stories expand in my hands before, but never beyond the, let's say, never beyond the award category that it was originally meant for. So I've not accidentally written a novella when I tried to write a short story. I've never accidentally written a novel. I've never tried to write a novel and ended up with a short story. I have a longer brainstorming process maybe, or I just have a sense for the consequences of an event or a moment or a world that I have a pretty good idea which one it's going to be or where I can slot it. Now, that 5,000 word requirement story might accidentally end up being 9,000, depending on how much fun I have, but technically it's still in the same category.
Wow, that's incredible. I keep looking at the time, and I'm sure there's so many things that I know Taylor wants to ask. I want to ask it. The time on these things just goes by so fast. I want to get Taylor an opportunity to ask a couple more questions before we get in. If you'll indulge us, CL, I certainly want to get two more big ones in. The one I want to get in, if possible, is so CL, and this is where I remember we backstage. I think I'd mentioned that. I had one semi-controversial question. It's not that controversial, but really and truly, CL. So your British Fantasy Award, you've winning editor, I believe, the Ignyte Award as a writer, and you've been nominated for the Nebula. These are pretty prestigious honors, and congratulations, of course, and very well deserved. And I can certainly see that after reading, at least only one book from you, and I can't wait to read more. So, as you know, there's been some teeny-weeny controversies going on recently about some pretty big awards. Just little controversies.
Really? What?
Yeah.
Huh. I didn't hear about it.
And Taylor and I, we talk all the time, and a lot of the members of the community, we all talk about this stuff. And at the end of the day, I always say that no organization is perfect, right? Irrespective of the organization. Neither are the especially the judging bodies and the people that make up these very, very these awards that have a lot of acclaim. But it doesn't, for me, it doesn't detract from the prestige of the award. And it doesn't necessarily taint it, but it does cast some things into question, right? So for you, having won and been nominated for some of these really top end awards, what do you think in general about some of the stuff you've seen going on with awards, and how do you feel about these awards?
I think okay, it's not a controversial question, but it is a tricky one to answer, especially on air. Because in general, I'm very skeptical of all award organizations. Because I like anyone, I love to be appreciated and I love to be honored, especially by places that have honored, the people that I idolized when I was a kid. Can I say that I don't want to win a Hugo? Probably not. Not and be honest. I still would probably like to win a Hugo. But I'm also very keenly aware of how even colonial these kinds of things can be. Like who has access, like the big question of the Chengdu Worldcon was a white, I think American, was making the decisions about whether Chinese people could be or not be on a ballot, or Chinese adjacent people, and that is colonial. Like, regardless of intentions, that was like, like, if it's so arbitrary as who has earned the white man's favor, then that is not really us. It's not saying anything about our prowess as writers and editors and artists and stuff. But before that, who is making those decisions for the awards anyway? With the Hugos, it's sure we can say it's about merit and about who has been enjoying, or who the readers have enjoyed the most, but you also have to think which readers are buying memberships and actually able to vote, which books are getting the publicity dollars to be put in front of a majority of readers. Like, if you see somebody's name over and over again, you will at least recognize them, even if you didn't read them. And so you'll think, oh, well, maybe that book was good, I'll vote for that. Like, there's so many different factors that are going into play. And with the Nebulas, it is a jury of your peers. Like, to be able to vote, you have to be in SIFWA. For science fiction writers, people make fun of me for saying SIFWA. SFWA. And you have to be in it to vote, which means there is again, like with the Hugos, there is a cliff you have to climb over before you can even vote. So it changes the voting body in ways that, like,
well,
yeah. So it's just, yeah.
I can definitely see what you're talking about. If I take a less prestigious example, like the Goodreads Choice Awards, like every year, BookTube, we have the same discourse, and we're like, "This is shit. Change it," and it never changes because you know who's going to win. You see the list, and you're like, "Okay, Mass is up there. King is going to take the horror if he releases a book that year." So it's
exactly.
And I think while the Goodreads Choice Awards has the intent of everyone that's on the site can vote, it's, an open voting system, you have to take into account who writes reviews on Goodreads and what books get what books will garner more reviews, because then that makes them much more in people's faces and say exactly the recognition. I didn't read any of the books in this category this year, but all my friends
I know that
love
name.
one,
Let me
so
click
I'll just do that one.
Yeah.
Like I'm guilty. I've done that before. Like with I remember in a middle grade section, I was like, oh, I know a lot of my friends like that one. I think it deserves it, so I voted for that book. So I do think that what you're talking about is present on the prestigious scale and on the micro scale. But the problem is when it's a prestigious scale, it's a bigger issue. Because the Goodreads Choice Awards, no one cares outside of BookTube, and maybe Book Talk, I'm not sure. But for the Nebula and the Hugo, people care, and rightfully so. So I think you see that reflected throughout all of the ranks of the awards. So I think that's a really good point that you make, is how do we square away knowing the issues with an award and also recognizing that it's a pretty cool thing to be able to give awards to people, in our space. How do you square that away? How do you fix it? I don't have the answers, but I think it's a really necessary mental exercise to go through and to say.
Yeah. It's also like, award season is very fraught because, especially like my first year eligible, I was like, oh, I want people to know. Like when I was trying to get like my short stories nominated and voted for, I wanted for people to see my work and stuff. So I'd always be tweeting about it and promoting about it. But this year, technically the Faithless is eligible for stuff, but it's not a priority for me anymore. If it happens, it happens. But there's a certain sort of capering and dancing that you have to do to get noticed, and it just doesn't sit right with me anymore. I don't want to have to perform like that. It's a very uh, the word I want to say is probably not appropriate for air, so I'm not going to say it. But it's a sort of, yeah. It doesn't feel right.
I think it's important to be able to shift your perspective on those things too. You know, if it was important to you once, doesn't mean it always has to be. So I really commend you for being open about the
Yes.
fact that your perspective has shifted, because that's normal, and that's something we should be able to do. So I think, yeah, I don't blame you for shifting your focus on that.
I think
Yeah.
as human beings, and of course writers, let's face it, we seek validation, right? That's a normal, very natural human reaction, fault, if you want to say. But that's something that we all pursue to a certain degree. And as writers, our egos are perhaps are a bit more a bit more convoluted on that end than other artists. But I think it is a liberating feeling though when you, as a writer, get to a place where the validation in terms of specifically things like awards isn't that important anymore, and that I think you get to a place where you realize I have my audience. And as a writer, you're always seeking for continuous improvement. I think most 99% of writers would say that they want to get better. They want to improve with every book. They want to continue progressing towards, this nebulous, place where, but then not find a way not to rest on your laurels and still strive for improvement after that. But I think what happens is as you write more books and as you start to be more aware of who your audience is, who likes your books, who doesn't like them, what you like about your writing, what you don't, and you become more accepting of all those things. I think you do get to a place where perhaps the validation doesn't mean what it used to be, and that's a great place to be in, because I think part of that is because you feel like you're learning your craft, you're learning the industry, and the industry is very complicated in and of itself, and also that within internally you're feeling, what, I don't need someone, the great others, to say that this is a good book that I've written.
Yeah.
Enough people whose opinion I respect, enough readers en masse have said it's a good book. I feel internally I wrote a good book. As a writer, you know your work. When you feel this isn't my best work over here, but this perhaps is. So I think it's a you're in a good place when you don't necessarily crave the validation, and I think that's very it can be very comforting to yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's so kudos to you, CL, that you've reached that spot. So I think most writers would be envious of that. And of course you have achieved some of those big awards. You're nominated for them. So maybe perhaps that's part of it, because you kind of know what the mountain looks like, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I definitely I'm aware that helps probably make my position, make it easier to sit in my position for sure.
So, Peel mentioned the time, but I have one question I always like to get in before you go. And I think it's one that, based on the themes you've talked about, you'll also appreciate. But I've heard you mention that, or I've heard mention of from other people as well, that there's this idea of elders, like the history, not deferring to, but listening to the wisdom of elders in your stories. And that kind of bleeds into the idea of your history, and the culture that you come from really impacts how you'll go forward in the future, and knowledge of that. So I am obsessed with origin stories. I always ask people about theirs. I'm a mythology nut. I find it so fascinating where people come from and where they go based on that. So I wanted to make this more of a personal aspect to you, is what is your origin story for loving stories? So it doesn't have to be a book, but if there was like a video game, a movie, something that made you fall in love with stories that you think has made you the storyteller you are today.
It's hard for me to say exactly what started it. So it's this would be like maybe my like mid origin, because my mom would always tell me like, oh, you were always in your bed with a crib reading a book upside down, and I'm like, well, I have no idea what I was reading, but that's great. I was reading all the time. Both of my grandmothers were teachers, and I think something that kind of made me really thrilled to be a reader was that I was at a Catholic school at the time, and so I would get a lot of days off. And my grandmother taught at a public school, so when my parents were like, "Well, we have to still go to work, so you're still going to school," and so they would send me to my grandmother's school instead, and I would sit in her classroom. And she would just be like, I really like you read, and I was younger than her third graders. She'd say, you read better than my third graders. Here, have a book and sit down. And I was like, yeah, I'm like 6 years old, and I read better than the 9-year-olds. And I think there was that kind of culture in my family of reading being a good thing, and intelligence being a good thing that we were always, it was always fostered in us. But then we get to the actual like books that kind of changed the game for me. I think when I knew I wanted to write, it was when I started reading like adult fantasy books. I remember reading Wheel of Time for the first time, and I've actually been on Wheel of Time podcast talking about this before, because the Scholastic Book Fair at my middle school had like a the Eye of the World, the first Wheel of Time book. They had it like divided into two, so it was two smaller books, and they were illustrated. So I just always thought they were kids' books, and I was like, this is the best book ever, and I was trying to find the books in the kids section. I never found them, and so one day, my aunt was taking me to a bookstore, and I was too shy to ask anybody all this time where they were. And so she asked the bookseller, and they took me to the adult section, and that was just like the beginning of the end of everything. And it was actually not until later that I kind of went back and hit some of the classics like Alana by Tamor Pierce and that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Oh, did they? Interesting.
Yeah, I was
I'm
going to call up Daniel's. Daniel's
the Great
comment.
Hunt. Okay. Yeah, I did not see the Great
on
Hunt.
The YA conversion project, he says.
They shouldn't have. They shouldn't have, because it worked.
See, I love that. I feel like, well, you unlocked a memory when you said Scholastic Book Fair. Those were my favorite when I was young. I was so excited to get in there. But yeah, I just love the fact that your family fostered a love of learning, because I find that from all the people that I ask these questions to, a lot of people who hold storytelling, the arts, the nebulous aspect of human communication, the people who hold that in high regard often were raised that way. It seems to be a common thread. So I think that's a beautiful thing that was instilled in you when you were young. So.
Yeah, that is absolutely wonderful. Again, I feel like we could keep chatting for the next couple hours, but we want to respect your time. You've been so generous with it. We are so grateful and honored that you joined us today on Page Chewing. It's just been a marvelous discussion. Before we go, we want to give an opportunity for sign-offs for you first, CL as our guest, and of course for Taylor. CL, where can people get to learn about you and your writing and your wonderful books, The Unbroken, such as The Unbroken, and social media, things like that? Where can they find you?
I am still on Twitter. My @ is @C_L_CLARK. I am also on Instagram, very vaguely, and Twitter, or not Twitter, TikTok. Occasionally I'll put up some sword videos. And I am CL Clark Writes on both of them, I think. But most importantly, if you go to my website, everything should be there. And my website is CL Clark Writes. Let me just make sure real quick before I promise you guys. Yeah, CLClarkWrites.com. And yeah, if anyone needs to get in contact with me, like I have like an icon for all of the social medias. Oh, and I have a newsletter that will probably have something go out next week. So it is clclark.substack.com.
Fantastic. I want to say I've been remiss. I haven't had time to add all of the socials for both CL and Taylor in the links to this video, but I will after we're done here. So I apologize. I've been tardy with that. Normally it's up beforehand. So, but I will put links to all CL's socials and Taylor's as well in afterwards, after the fact. So my wonderful co-host Taylor, what about you?
I also wanted to mention that the artist that you talked about earlier, I will include that name in the comments down below. It'll be the first comment. I'll be sure to put it down there so people can access the fun meme-ish content out there about your characters. But yes, just to reiterate, thank you so much for joining us. This has been delightful. I've said many times, but like this has jumped up my TBR now because it deals with so many themes that I adore and to wrestle with in my fantasy. But if you would like to find me, my name is Taylor. My booktube channel is Made Between the Pages. I do book reviews, kind of the standard booktube videos, as well as Japan life reading vlogs. So I show my life in Japan, in Fukuoka, Japan, quite often. I am also an assistant editor over on Before We Go blog, so you can find my reviews in an official capacity there. But I do write just like head thoughts, head empty, no thoughts reviews, right when I finish books on Goodreads. So you can find those there as well. I feel like there's something I'm forgetting to talk about. Right. So I am on Twitter. I'm still on that platform. I want to steal your words, yell nebulously on Instagram, but the best place to find me at this point in time is probably Twitter. You can find me most often, besides PL, doing page chewing either on my channel or as is currently on his channel. And I'm just so delighted to be able to be a part of this, these kinds of conversations. I'm going to be on cloud nine all day. Okay, this is the best way to start my day. I love talking to people who love stories. So again, thank you so much. And I'm just delighted.
Thank you guys so much. I had so much fun. So much fun. It was an absolute honor.
Yeah.
Well, the honor is ours. Thank you, Taylor. Taylor's selling her short story, by the way. Her reviews are fantastic. So they're not empty. The reviews are awesome. P.L. Stewart, you can find the books www.plstewart.com. The John King Saga, 3 books out now. The 4th one just got released. 4 books out now. The 4th one just got released. Lions Pride recently. 7-book series. Thank you, Taylor, who I am honored who Taylor was willing to, I would add, provide one of the endorsement quotes for the book. So that was, a real privilege. So, social medias, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, I'm still hanging in there. As well, I will again steal via CL through Taylor nebulously on Instagram and Facebook and other. But really, you want to find me, Twitter, DMs are open. Before I Go blog as well, where I'm also assistant editor, as Taylor is. Shout out to the wonderful Beth Tabler, our fearless leader. And that's Before I Go blog. And other than that, yes, beside Taylor, that's usually where you can find me doing page chewing on either Taylor's channel, and Taylor posts some amazing content that has nothing to do with page chewing. So her vlogs are just amazing. And so we have some really exciting stuff planned for page chewing. Like just like this, I know, we have people like CL Clark coming on. That's we're blessed that that's the kind of long form content we're able to put out. So, and just, we encourage you to keep watching. Thank you for those of you who tuned in, and especially those who got up really early, especially on the East Coast for this. And thanks to all people in the chat, such as Daniel and Shade Tree Reads, for joining us. It really means a lot. And this was just such a fascinating conversation. And again, we're so honored to have an author and a person, a CL's character, join us. And this was just fantastic. So we're going to sign off. But once again, thank you so much for tuning in. And you really, really, really need to read CL's books. They are fantastic. There's a reason why they've been getting so much hype the hype is real. So once
Thank you so
again,
much.
thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Bye bye now.